The subject of the lesson is God, the only cause and creator. A favorite, wonderful, strong kind of subject matter and lesson. The first word that attracted me was in the golden text. Thou art worthy, O Lord, to receive glory and honor and power, for thou hast created all things. And this is what interested me so much. And for thy pleasure they are and were created. The word pleasure as a relationship between God and man appears in several religions. The one I'm aware of is Epicureanism. But here, the word pleasure conjures up for me the relationship that Jesus spoke of. Fear not, little flock, for it is thy Father's good pleasure to give thee the kingdom. That's so warm and reassuring that God, Spirit, is our Father, and he delights in his offspring, spiritual ideas that we are. In the story, let's see. Well, we'll come back to that. Responsive reading. I've always been delighted by the psalmist's use of the physical world to explain the greatness and power of God, who covers thyself with light as with garment, who laid the foundations of the earth. How manifold are thy works in wisdom. But isn't it true that this is the material world that's being described? But Mrs. Eddy told us in her glossary on earth that earth is a compound idea, so that every one of these descriptions is really a statement of the power and glory and honor of God's Spirit. And that is brought up in verse 30. Thou sendest forth thy Spirit, they are created, and thou renewest the face of the earth. So all is spiritual, and this description of the human perception is imbued with the understanding that God is Spirit. Verse 33, I will sing unto the Lord as long as I live. And that is, of course, eternally. I will sing praise to my God while I have my being. And that is, of course, eternal life. And so what appears to be a very beautiful description of the physical world, seen humanly, is really an outpouring of the understanding that God is Spirit, and we are safe in eternal life as spiritual ideas. The lesson itself is kind of interestingly arranged or set up so that I see the definition of God as all-seeing, all-acting, all-wise, all-loving, and eternal is covered pretty obviously in each one of the sections. So that is the kind of the structure that I've seen in the lesson. In section 1, we have a very important statement. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And immediately that sense of time rather than eternity is corrected with Mrs. Eddy's section on Genesis 1. The infinite has no beginning. The word beginning is employed to signify the only. And that just sets it all up for spirit to reign. The universe, she also says, the universe reflects God. There is but one creator and one creation, and this creation consists of the unfolding of spiritual ideas and their identities, which are then embraced in the infinite mind and forever reflected. So there is eternity and spirituality and God as spirit immediately set up as the interpretation of the Bible section. And what is spiritual sense? She covers so well. With spiritual sense is the discernment of spiritual good. And that will be carried out in section 2 with Job. That is, this is the section that I think stresses that God is the all-seeing. There's an emphasis on sight, which with Job is the spiritual discernment of God, because he says, I have heard of thee by the hearing of the ear, but now mine eye seeth thee. And so that's been anticipated with spiritual sense is the discernment of spiritual good. And when he finally saw the spiritual good, which is God as spirit, then he was released from his imprisonment in the material senses. I have a little background on Job, which has made me appreciate this book in the Bible tremendously. There is a play written called J.B. by, I think it's Priestley, that some of our students used to read in high school. And it's the story of Job put into a play form. The book has had a lot of influence in the rest of the Bible. It's called, by many Bible scholars, the greatest poem in the world's great literature. It's a dramatic poem in an epic story. It's to throw light on the worldwide problem of the mystery of suffering in a world that is governed by the good God. That is what most Bible scholars and those who study the Bible also as a piece of literature give as the general theme of Job. I give it the theme that it is an Old Testament story that is a clear expression of the Christ at work forever, in the forever. Here we are in the Old Testament. It was probably written some 2,000 years before Jesus, but we're not sure when it was written, but it was certainly written in the age of the patriarchs, which is very early on. And yet I see the Christ at work, and it gives me that wonderful sense of the Christ always at work in the human realm. Job was a real man. He made a lasting impression on the ages following. He's mentioned in Ezekiel 14, verse 14. He's mentioned in James 3, verse 11. There are 5 divisions in Job's work. The first part, he loses his prosperity. We all know about that. That's the suffering. In part 2, there's the debate with his friends. That they suggest that he's a bad man, but no one knows for sure, and we cannot judge. Now that's not very Christ-like yet. Part 3, that they conclude in their arguments that suffering is a discipline as well as for a test or punishment. And while part 3 is going on, there begins to gather a storm in the background of this debate, and it's becoming a whirlwind. Jehovah's presence is depicted in this poetic book as a brightening against the dark of the storm, which I think makes it literally very, very exciting. Part 4 is the voice from the whirlwind, which is what we have in the lesson. It's a training in faith for God is so good, so wise, so powerful, such a loving Father, that we can trust Him and rest our souls in perfect peace. Now that's a quote from Bible scholars who have looked at it. My quote is that the Christ is at work on Job's consciousness. And that wonderful, wonderful statement that brings in the sense of the all-seeing. Job answered the Lord and said, I know that thou canst do everything, and no thought can be withholden from thee. So that's the infinitude and the eternity of God. I have heard of thee by the hearing of the ear, but now mine eye seeth thee. And that's why I sent this section as being overlaid with that definition of God as the all-seeing. That sight is used here. It's very staticky. Well, I have my good phone. I'm using my good phone, so. Okay. Eye is spiritual perception of God and of Himself. This is the seeing of the Christ. I always search the Old Testament, the work of forever Christ. I see it appears in Job in this I idea. I then went to Paul Stark-Seeley's article on perception as a kind of backup to this sense of seeing as a statement of spiritual perception. And there are just 2 short passages I'd like to read and then suggest that reading the whole thing is just a wonderful experience in the seeing as spiritual demarcation. It's in the Classic Articles, the first one, that anthology, and it's on page 82. Seeley. His first paragraph awakened me to recognize that he's going to talk about true perception or spiritual understanding. He says, a physical scientist has stated that the human eye perceives but 1/40,000 millionth. Did you hear that? But 1/40,000 millionth part of the material universe. How inadequate, then, is this physical organ as a medium for reliable information? By far the greater part of what is taking place in the temporary so-called material universe, the eye never sees, and it takes no note at all of the permanent spiritual universe of divine mind. Says Paul, eye hath not seen nor ear heard the things which God hath prepared for them that love Him. That's from 1 Corinthians. Where then is the perceptive capacity to be found that acquaints us with God and his will? And then he proceeds with Christian science turns back the testimony of matter, denying that either man himself or the senses of the true man are in matter, and affirming that the true man and his senses are the expression of eternal mind, and endowed with the permanency of divine mind. Then one other paragraph. God is referred by Mrs. Eddy as the all-seeing, page 587. Where is the seeing activity of God taking place? That is like asking, where is life that is God expressed? Or where is the love that is God made evident? God mind has one and only one mode of expression, namely his ideas. The true individuality of each one of us is God's idea, and as such must express the perceptive activity of the all-seeing ego. That's what Job had to do. Perceptive activity of God, just as the knowing and loving activity of God is eternally operating in, is evidenced by, and is inseparable from his ideas. And so that now mine eye seeth you, as from Job, has all that truth behind it, and is summarized probably inadequately, but constantly by me as the activity of the Christ, bringing about the spiritualization of God and the perception of man as idea. And that's in the Old Testament. I just love when that's in the Old Testament. And that's why I love Job this time. All acting, section 3, gives us Nehemiah and the work of the works of Nehemiah to rebuild the destroyed Jerusalem. Even while Nehemiah was a hostage or in exile, however what you want to call it, in the court of the Persian king, who had, well, first the Assyrians had attacked Judah and Israel. Second, they were taken over by the Babylonians, and then the Persians, and the Babylonians actually destroyed the temple and most of Jerusalem. And then they were taken over by the Persians. And the Persians, of course, took hostages or took some of the best of the Jews to live at their court so that there would no be resurgence against the Persians. And one of those people was this Nehemiah, who became, as the lesson tells us, became the cupbearer, which is a very high position, to bear the cup safely to the king and in support of the king to, what is his name? It's built on the word Xerxes. They all are built on the word Xerxes. And he was so well respected that he was given permission, as we know, to return to Jerusalem, rebuild the gates, because he had heard from people recently fleeing that it was in terrible shape. And against all odds, and here we go, with the aid of the Christ. Put the Christ right back there in the Old Testament. Let me give you a little background on Nehemiah. His name means Jehovah hath consoled. He was from Judah, and he was in Persia in exile. He was the cupbearer to Artaxerxes in the 20th year of the king's reign, and that was about 445 BC. Always keep in mind the standard date, which is about 900 BC, for the reign of David, the time of David. So it's about 400 years later than that. He was authorized to go to Jerusalem, but notice that he had to return at a certain time. So he was working within a time limit. All these things were against him, and yet the works were done. And I'd always think of all the material laws, all the degradations of man were present when Jesus entered the scene. And he had only 3 years. I just see so much anticipation in some of the Old Testament people of the Christ, which animated both them and Jesus, the Christ forever, so that Jesus was able to do the works, or the signs following, as he calls his healings, under such untoward positions. He faced jealousy of the people who were then ruling over Jerusalem, because it was a captive state. He faced jealousy. They were going to do harm to him to stop the building. And they managed to stop the work for several years because Artaxerxes became worried that he wouldn't come back. And so he brought back the Nehemiah when the work was not completed. But a few years later, Artaxerxes let him go back again. And this time, he was able to restore the temple, which he had not been able to do in the short time that he had been allotted for doing the gates. So he accomplished the restoration of the temple and the dedication of the walls on his second time back. And more than that, this is why I'm very fond of Nehemiah, he brought social justice to Jerusalem. He stopped the exacting of taxes, terrible taxes by the nobles. He rescued poor Jews from usury, and he refused to take a salary for himself because of the poverty of the people. He was in office 12 years. He kept a table of good food for 150 Jews who were coming out of captivity, returning from captivity, and had not yet set up a life in Jerusalem. He made provision for the priests and Levites and for the due and constant celebration of divine worship. He insisted on the sanctity of the precincts of the temple. One of the rooms in the temple had been set aside with personal attachment to one of the priests, and he threw that person out of the temple. And it is so parallel to Jesus throwing the money changers out of the temple. You can just see it as the second phase. So it's described as out with the priests' families who had contracted, this is in addition, out with the priest families who had contracted heathen marriages. And he always kept the Sabbath day totally holy and dedicated to worship. So I thought you'd like to know that the Christ was working in Nehemiah 445 BC. For the Christ is just absolutely ageless, eternal, and we have the Christ now to do the same. Mrs. Eddy summarizes the excellence of this occurrence. No, in God's creation, ideas became productive and obedient to mind. That's from her Genesis chapter. Look how productive he became, how obedient he was to mind. That's an idea at work. And then one other sentence, no wisdom is wise but his wisdom, no truth is true, no love is lovely, no life is life but the divine, no good is but the good God bestows. And that's another name for the Christ at work. Okay, in section 4, and section 5, we're in the New Testament. Yes, we're in the New Testament. And here, he is the all-seeing, all-acting, all-wise, all-loving, and eternal. That's what God is. And the Christ at work shows that. And here we have this wonderful statement in a dramatic scene of Jesus justifying all material laws, all material destruction. And it's very interesting to me that in the story, in the book of Nehemiah, which I have read, there is this lightening of the darkness in the coming storm that I mentioned, that is supposedly Jehovah, so that light is appearing in a storm, which is against all material laws. That just isn't. And here is Jesus in the midst of a storm, and there comes his peace, so that the storm just gives up. And he would not have been roused by the storm because he was asleep. He was just so confident of all about him was light. All about him was his God. I found that parallel interesting. And then Mrs. Eddy says in that section, there is no vapid fury of mortal mind, expressed in earthquake, wind, wave, lightning, fire, bestial ferocity. And this so-called mind is self-destroyed. In the presence of the Christ, it just cannot exist. That's the self-destruction. In the book, Mary Baker Eddy, Christian Healer, there are so many wonderful times, not just in healing people, but in her command of the natural world, that it just boggles the mind. There is one in which she is searching for a room because she was so homeless. I think she moved 28 times or something like that. And the woman didn't like her. She faced a lot of hatred. Even when she did healing of people, they would come out of the evil, and then they would say, I hate you, I hate you, I hate you. Well, this woman said that she just had a bad reputation, but she'd let her have a room if she could turn these dead plants that had apparently suffered from non-watering or something like that back to healthy plants. So Mrs. Eddy, I don't think she was Mrs. Eddy then, but our leader took the plants down to the basement, shut out all the light, and left them there for 3 days. And when they went down, they were green and bright and beautiful. Now, I just think that is the command over the material world, because she knew God is the only cause and creator, and growth is unfoldment. Okay, well, anyway, that's in Christian Healer, yes. There's another one in Christian Healer where there was a storm gathering, very dark cloud, etc. She was then Mrs. Eddy in her own home. And it was very fierce looking. And she just went to the window and obviously prayed. And the dark cloud disappeared. And the storm never occurred. I just think that is a demonstration of the Christ. Okay. And then, of course, the section 5 is the healing of the leper. This, again, is the action of the Christ. The revelation when he looked, the knowledge when he looked at the leper, that he was, in reality, stripped of all these mortal beliefs. He was God's idea. He could do nothing but express God. And that lovely adjectival form was in this leper healing, moved with compassion. He put forth his hand and touched him and said unto him, I will be thou clean. Straight Christ, undiluted. And section 6, one verse in the Bible and one in Science and Health I hold to as summarizing. And God is able to make all grace abound toward you, that ye, always having all sufficiency in all things, may abound to every good work. This is a wonderful idea to hold to in times where people don't seem to have all sufficiency, and to abound to every good work, with storms, with finances, etc. But that is the mortal dream. That is not recognizing that God is the only cause and creator, and that can only be good. The unfoldment of good is our only experience. And then her last statement, a wonderful summary. Creation is ever appearing and must ever continue to appear from the nature of its inexhaustible source. And I think this lesson in going through God as all-seeing, all-acting, all-loving shows that the principle of the whole universe, including the human perception of it, is unfoldment, is essence, spirit, God as spirit, and as principle, which is, of course, love. So I thought it was a very fine lesson.